Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. My name is Jonathan Nevere and I have the distinct pleasure of being the guest host for tonight's reading and interview. Today we're here to celebrate the release of Jean-Paul Garnier's Cardboard Spaceship, a short story anthology now available from Shacklebound Books. This anthology is a collection of short stories by the author, celebrating over 7 years of writings in science fiction. And I'm going to just read one of the several blurbs on the back, which really captures, I think, the spirit of the anthology. This is by Carter Kaplan, the editor of Emanations. Shifting worlds, phosphorescent landscapes, dissolving people haunted by phantom psyches. Such are the materials of Garnier's visions, rendered in a fusion of literary mirage and hard science fiction that relentlessly shakes the cage of the human condition. So Jean-Paul Garnier is the owner of Space Cowboy Books bookstore and publishing house, producer of Simultaneous Times podcast, 2023 Laureate Award winner, BSFA, Ignite, and British Fantasy Award finalist, and editor of SFPA's Starline magazine. He is also the deputy editor-in-chief of Worlds of IF and Galaxy magazines, and in 2024 he won the Laureate Award for Best Editor. He's written many books of poetry and science fiction. I'm going to hand it over to Jean-Paul to read us a selection from Cardboard Spaceship.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for hosting this evening. I'd also like to thank Michael Butterworth, who wrote the introduction for this book. Very deeply honored by that. And also Eric Fomley from Shacklebound Books, my editor and publisher for this book, who did a wonderful job and is doing amazing things in general if you like short form science fiction. I'm going to read a very brief story called Due Date, which originally appeared in Semjoku magazine out of Korea, edited by a wonderful fantasy and horror writer named Todd Sullivan. Due Date. She waves her hand over my console, and the transaction is complete. Thank you. Your due date's in 3 weeks. If you need to renew, feel free to ping me anytime before the due date. Mysterious Island. Not a good sign. It's never a good sign when they check out books about the sea. It means they're lonely. And if they're lonely, they're sad. I do my best to prevent this by making suggestions, and of course, the books we stock. But in the end, I can't tell people what to check out. They have to have at least this freedom. But ocean stories, a bad sign. By now, they know when I'm trying to talk them out of a selection. And if I do, word will spread, and within a month, they'll all be reading it anyway. And the sadness will spread crew-wide. It can be worse than that. If they start checking out books about space travel, I know there's real trouble. One might think that such books would be a comfort out here, reading about people in similar situations. But from experience, I know this to be an act of desperation. It usually means they've forgotten what it's like to be planet-bound. When they forget the gravity, there's no coming back. If they reach for the sci-fi, I have to call the doctor to intervene. But I've painted a depressing picture. Since I curated this selection before we took off, I know the stock really well and can typically make suggestions that help to improve overall morale. There are definitely things I would do differently if I could do it all again, though. Like ocean and space books, I would have left those behind if I had known. Something about those great wide open spaces always spells longing. And that's an emotion that we can't have lingering around on a ship this size. I wonder if when people traveled the world on the actual seas, if their librarians faced the same troubles. I also try to steer them away from the mysteries. One would think that these would be a great pastime while we hurtle through the nothingness with little to do. But I see it almost every time. They start to get suspicious. It's not enough to have the mystery stay on the pages. They begin to doubt their bunkmates, sometimes the entire crew. Makes my job difficult. Back home, they were such an easy sell for those needing to while away the time. Nonfiction. That was supposed to be the main thing. After all, we're supposed to be preparing for our new life. I stocked every book on farming, construction, and basically everything we'll need to survive. Not that the folks on this trip don't have tons of skills like that, but we're due to get rusty after all these years of inactivity. No matter how much I try to push these subjects, no one wants to hear it. The thought of soil in their hands is almost as bad as thinking about the sea or space. The reminders of home drag my shipmates right out of the present and back to darker times. One would think that picturing a tree in your mind would be a peaceful affair, but it's just another reminder of what we're leaving behind and the uncertainty to which we travel. Do you have another copy of Mysterious Island? The question draws me out of my contemplative state, and so it's begun to spread. The infection of the mind, missing the oceans, all that water, and shrinking at the thought of where we're going and all the things it might lack. It's checked out at the moment. How about something educational? They're gone before I can hand them a book. The nonfiction route almost never works. Still, I have to try. It's understandable that they don't want the reminders, but we had better be ready when we arrive, even though that's a decade away. That's a long time not to hone one's trade. Even longer, not to be thinking about the work. For most of us, our arrival seems so far away, and it is. But if we start to slip now, there's no telling how bad things could get in the remaining time of the journey. At least for the moment, everyone's still doing their ship duties. But Mysterious Island? I may need to speak to the captain. What books would I have brought if I had known what I know now? It's hard to say. I'm comforted by the books themselves. Even just the smell of them calms me. And that's why we decided to bring physical books. Something about having the real object makes us feel more connected to those that wrote them. Or that's what we thought. It still works for me, but I wonder if I'll fall victim to the same malaise that's infecting the crew. I've got to think of some new titles to recommend, something to help get them out of this funk. Typically, when all else fails, I would divert to the classics. Now I know that won't work either. In the early days of our ship, I tried that, but the pacing was all wrong for everybody. Our trip is a slow one, so nobody wanted to read slow books about fanciful people that can move around at their leisure. No one was reading much in those days anyway. The boredom had yet to sink in. Everyone was still excited about our new lives and our upcoming adventures. Nothing like years of routine to get the restlessness going. Eventually, everyone took to reading voraciously, but it didn't last. No one was interested in a book club. I guess the idea came off as stuffy, and no one was reading the same titles anyway. Well, that was before the pattern started to emerge. No requests have come in, but I'm starting to wonder if we should have brought along some self-help books. Those would probably be, though they would probably be embarrassed about checking those out. Knowing what books the crew reads can be an intimate thing. Anyway, I didn't bring many. The looks that the crew give me are a clear indicator that they too are disappointed with my selection. And they are not pleased when they sense my reluctance to check out their request. If only they knew that I'm trying to protect them from the dreaded malaise. How could I have known before being put out here myself? I'm afflicted with the same dangerous mindsets, but I can't let anyone see that I am troubled. It would only make things worse and further interfere with trust put in my position. If I could do it all over again, I would have brought magazines. Something light that makes people feel connected with the goings-on of the world, rather than the lonely places and dramas. Information that can be taken in bite-sized pieces without the commitment of time that goes along with a novel. Our job, at this point, it's mainly to wait, so the crew feels the passage of time in a painfully slow fashion. If I had brought more cheap entertainment, perhaps they would have something to discuss with one another that avoids the more brutal aspects of our position. I think it might have worked. I wish I had known. Maybe the idea of something disposable would have been appealing to them, something we don't have to recycle over and over again. Or should I have brought audiobooks? These days, everyone that comes to the library seems to have an aversion to conversing with me. If I had stocked audiobooks, it would have brought along with it a whole cast of strangers' voices. I think it's the sound of my voice that makes them cringe. with the fact that most of my job consists of fairly scripted dialogue. The audiobooks could have spoken to them, introduced a slew of foreign voices that no one would have had the time to grow sick of. But now I'm speculating, and it won't do the crew any good to think about what could have been, what I could have brought, or what I could have done better. It's too late for that. But it occurs to me that perhaps it's not the material that's the problem. It could be that the act of reading is solitary. Everyone feels alone, and I'm giving them one more reason to be alone. I think back to all those smiling faces of the children at the terrestrial library during story time and realize that that's what we've been missing all the while. We need to read together, to go through the stories together. Perhaps it's not the stories of the sea, mysteries, or sci-fi, but the fact that we need to face our loneliness together. So I'm not going to worry about what books people check out. Reading should always be a good thing. Instead, I'm going to put out a notice that tomorrow evening, the ship's library will be hosting our first adult storytime read-along. Doing something fun together should raise the spirits of the crew, and we can face our loneliness together for a change.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. And it seems I'm not alone in that being one of my favorites from the collection. According to the audience and our guests here today, this is a fan favorite. And I actually do have a question about it for you a little bit later in the interview. So we're going to jump into some questions. And I wanted to remind everyone who is here in the audience that if you have any questions, please do feel free to drop them into the chat. I'll keep my eye on it and hopefully we can fit them in as well. So Jean-Paul, I'm going to start a little bit big and make my way down to the specific. And Cardboard Spaceship, it brings together a collection of short stories written over the last 8 years. But in addition to that, you've written a lot of short form fiction. And whether it's short stories or flash or drabble, you've also written quite a few novellas. And I wondered if you could start by just talking a little bit about what is it about short fiction and the short form that attracts you so much? Why are you drawn to short form fiction?
Well, interestingly enough, I'm not. 25,000 word novella, that's my sweet spot. That's the length of story I love to tell. I love to be brutally concise, and that lets me do most of what a novel can do without a lot of filler. Short stories I've always viewed as my training ground for long form fiction. I think as an author, it's the best place to learn, especially if someone who's concerned with being concise. Flash fiction and drabbles are wonderful for that. To fit an entire story arc, whatever arc you might be using, into that little space is quite challenging. It doesn't give you a lot of space for characterization. It doesn't give you a lot of space for setting, which is okay with me. People that have read my work probably know that I'm usually pretty light on setting. I'm an aphant. I have aphantasia, so setting is generally fairly irrelevant to me. I like to write from an emotional space more so than physical space. And so most of my short fiction has been a training ground for me. Not that I don't enjoy writing it, I do. I find that my short stories get shorter and shorter the more I write them. But for the last couple of years, I've actually written very little short form. Novellas are my main jam now. I think I will return to writing short fiction eventually. I definitely have a couple pieces about halfway done, but that's something that happens to me a lot in short fiction. I'll often take an idea, start it as a poem, see if there's any meat to the idea, how much I can get from it, maybe move into short fiction from there. And then, ideally I just don't stop. It ends up being a novella. It's so, yeah, well, I love reading short stories. I mean, I'm an advocate for it. I try to support short fiction in the podcast and releasing anthologies and so forth. I absolutely love reading it. But I love getting carried away both as a writer and a reader in long form.
That's really interesting to me that you write and things get shorter. That's to me a very unusual unusual approach. But you mentioned a word, and I'm going to jump ahead to a different question. You said brutally concise, that you can be brutally concise. So I've been thinking a little bit about the fictional worlds that you create, and I had actually written down that I take them in as being very sparse in details, and it works really well for your style of writing. And could you just talk about that literary tactic a little bit? So you talked about a kind of condition that drives you to write in a particular way, but what do you see that doing for the experience of the story?
Well, I've interestingly, I'm probably more of a poet than a fiction writer. I've written a lot more poetry than I have fiction, at any rate. And one of the things I love about writing poetry is, I mean, you have to pack a lot of punch into something small, and sort of an unintended pun there. One of the things I do when I write poetry is, I've done a lot of boxing in my life, and I like to take the rhythms of boxing and apply them to the meter in the poetry. Every time someone tells me, "Oh, your writing is very punchy," I'm like, "Yes, yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to do." I want it to be like a battle, and when you're fighting, when you're in a battle, you don't have time to think about details. Fist hits face. You're not going to be considering the wallpaper or whatever's happening at that point. And because I don't see imagery in my mind like most people do, when I'm reading things that are setting heavy, it's sort of a lot of superfluous detail to me. Not that I can't appreciate it or the beauty of setting. I certainly can, but it's something that is a little forced in my writing, or I have to force myself to include it. I know that most people do see pictures in their mind and want that as part of the experience. So I will add it for you. But it's not something that comes naturally for me as a writer. I want the work to be emotionally charged. When it comes to sensory input and sensory richness in the writing, I'm more likely to reach for tactile experience, or olfactory experience, or auditory experience. So those senses are much more important to me just as an individual, and I try to incorporate that in my writing. I also love, I'm not a fan of the modifier. I doubt anyone would call my work purple, hopefully. I love the brutal concision of noun verb. One of the pieces of writing advice that I employ a lot of the time is something J.G. Ballard said: one modifier per sentence, if that. Some people say one modifier per noun or verb. I like to try and avoid them altogether when I can. Lately, I've been reading more crime fiction. I just finished a Jim Thompson book today, and the crime writers, the noir writers, I'm not particularly well versed in them yet, but I'm trying to become. And they tend to do that, to be really, really slim on modifiers, and I appreciate that because it gives a punchiness. Modifiers start modifying each other when you start stacking them too, and as an editor, that sort of thing just drives me nuts. I'm not one of those writers that likes to flex my vocabulary. If you pay attention in my books, it's like you won't find words above 3 syllables. I find the more complicated the subject that I'm talking about, the more simple the language I want to use. I hope that's something the reader enjoys. It's something I enjoy, so I write that way. Not that I don't know big words, but I don't want to send you to the dictionary. I want you to enjoy the tale, the yarn that I'm spinning.
There's a story at the end of the anthology, I think it's called Birth of Fire, is that right? Which is a really wonderfully effective, I think, job of doing that, of taking a kind of macrocosmic narrative and a microcosmic narrative together, but your language is just so on point and rhythmic and short, and it just is very, I think, expansive at the same time in how it conveys meaning. Um, I'm actually going to stick with setting for a minute, surprisingly, though, but not descriptive setting, but more of your sort of decisions about where you place your stories. Because most of the stories in the anthology, maybe two exceptions that are space-based or spaceship-based, the rest of them take place really in the primary world. But it's a very unique version of the primary world, and I'm just fascinated by this. It feels timeless and yet familiar. And it's our world, but yet it isn't our world. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I actually identified exactly what that was recently. It's funny, there's patterns in everyone's work, but we don't necessarily see them while we're working. And rereading some of my work, I realized that almost everything I've written takes place in the near past. Um, it's mostly mid-aughts, but if the internet hadn't happened. And I think that's where you're getting that familiarity, but there's the difference there, which I suppose in a way is where I wish it happened. The culture hadn't moved so quickly in a weird direction that I'm not terribly comfortable with. Um, a big part of this too, and I think the strangeness that you might find in my writing, is something that was 100% inspired by, or at least she helped me to identify it. A writer named Anna Kavan. One of her last books was called Ice, and it's this just beautifully bizarre, surreal, unreliable narrator. One of the characters dies hundreds of times through the book, and it's very strange. As a reader, it comes off as kind of alarming. And what I realized that what she did was she just obliterated the border between the interior and the external world. That thought manifest, essentially, that what the character is feeling becomes reality. And that's just such a luscious and alluring technique, and appeals to me greatly. And the idea of, in the story you referenced, Birth of Fire, the idea of simultaneity, which is something writing is just notoriously terrible at doing. It's very hard to have two times happen layered on top of each other in writing. I've seen it done. There's a few writers that have pulled it off, at least somewhat. And that's something that's incredibly appealing to me, that I keep trying to work techniques to figure out how to do that. Also, I try to pay a lot of attention to the prosody of the writing, and the rhythmic structure of things. And I find that that's, at least for me, that's a great way to get the emotion across. And that's paramount to me. The emotion, I hope to make the reader feel rather than see, which I guess is sort of a come into my world thing.
Well, I mean, it's just really fascinating and really well done. The strangeness of the way that something extraordinary intrudes into the ordinary in your stories is just it's really really powerful. Let's talk characters. So again, there's this disturbingly familiar aspect to the types of people in these worlds, and they strike me as strangely tragic in their ordinariness. And then they're often thrown into these extraordinary circumstances. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Franks and the Bettys?
So one of the things that makes me gravitate towards science fiction in general, and away from literary fiction, is, and to put it in the most base and offensive to some terms, literary fiction is mundane things happening to extraordinary people, which is not interesting to me at all. I don't care about the rich, or whatever their petty dramas are. Um, but something fantastical happening to your average Joe, your average Jane. That science fiction has always excelled at that. And that to me is incredibly appealing. Most of us are not fabulous, fancy folks. I'm certainly not. I've got a nice hat, but I've got a healthy dose of redneck in here too. So um, a well redneck, that is. But I think it's much more relatable. I mean, most people's lives, everyone's life is important, but most people's lives in the grand scheme of, what's going to end up in the history books is fairly inconsequential, including mine. Um, and to me, that's just so much realer than, you know, I don't know, think Great Gatsby or a book that just makes me gag because I don't care about rich people soap opera. And Rand. These are the things I don't want to read. I just don't want to read them. I'm not cut from that cloth. I don't know about that world, and I don't particularly want to. These are the people I've worked for most of my life, and they don't make for a good story, in my opinion. No offense if you like that kind of stuff. No offense intended. But to me, that's just more interesting, that to for characters to be blue collar. And we live in such a strange world and universe that's so hard to make sense of in the first place. You start scratching beneath the surface, it makes even less sense. And I think that bewilderment is certainly something that's part of my life, and I think it's something other people can relate to as well.
Yeah, maybe continuing on that line, I think, you've just raised a couple of themes that I picked up on through the characters and the struggles. So maybe we could talk about the kind of conflicts that they encounter in the stories, because they do seem to have a consistency, whether it's the mundane grind of working life, overarching monocultures, corporate overlords, cookie cutter social design. Um, can you just talk a little bit about maybe that role of power and conflict coming down onto these characters, and how you strategize that? Do you think consciously about the hook? What's the process to make that take place in your story crafting, and then what kinds of themes really drive that?
Well, something that I didn't realize I was doing at first and then realized, which was kind of delightful to me, is, I've worked, I don't know, I've had 45 different jobs in my life or something. I've done a lot of trivial labor. And one of the last long-term jobs I had that was one of those things that's just utterly useless in the grand scheme. And, you sit there all day going, God, I wish I could use my mind instead of just my meat. Um, was I was a bellhop at a corporate hotel, and it was just soul sucking as one can imagine. But the wonderful thing that came out of this was I realized that all of my villains were taken from corporate middle management. These are the people that don't have actual power but want to exercise it, and in general are horrible in that middle zone, um where they want to exercise their power over the underlings, but they don't actually have any real power. And so a lot of my villains, that working that job gave me so much inspiration for stories, because it's all trivial, and most of us are caught up into situations like this. Um and they're dehumanizing, and isolation and dehumanization are pretty regular themes in my work. Also miscommunication, and as someone who's had a lot of difficulty understanding other people or feeling misunderstood, that just I gravitate towards that. It's one of the reasons I really like Soviet science fiction writers and film. It's interesting and very telling about our culture. When you look at American science fiction, particularly in film, xenophobia is the number one theme, um, which is disappointingly American. When you read or watch Soviet science fiction, communication barriers are one of the core themes. And that's something that's so interesting to me. I mean, even speaking the same language, we're not using the same words the same way necessarily. We often completely misunderstand each other. And in retrospect, sometimes we realize we've misunderstood our own statements. Um, and that's just part of the human condition. Again, that bewilderment, and something that I love to explore. I mean, there's so many crazy thought experiments you can do on the page, and science fiction is just like really adept at doing this, because you can have a nonverbal language or something, that's not emotion-based language either. And all the problems that would arise from these things. I think sometimes, when we think of space travel, it's really the shit that should be that's simple in our lives that we don't even think about, that becomes super complicated. If you've ever traveled to a country where you don't speak the language, It's like all of a sudden going to the bathroom is some drama. Um, it's the little things that can greatly complicate, and I love blowing those up into a story.
I wanted to ask about the story Due Date that you read, and I think this is a good moment since we're talking about ships. It's a fascinating intersection of your professional activities and your interests in science fiction. As a bookstore owner, I imagine you get a lot of you do a lot of recommending of books, I would imagine, to potential readers, as a librarian would. And the idea of a ship's library as a repository of sort of practical knowledge and entertainment is really fascinating, especially as the analysis of what books get taken out occur. I loved how you connected the literary choices by readers to a kind of psychological profiling. I thought that was really interesting. But can you just talk a little bit about give us a little insight into this story? Is this driven by the experience of being a bookstore owner?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a couple. The inspiration for this is a few things. One has to do with the bookseller, and the other is again back to the sort of eeriness of the mundane. We tend to think of space travel as terribly exciting, and I love reading space opera, and there's all this action. But I mean, if we were on a colony ship, we would be sitting there with nothing to do for so long, and boredom and malaise really would be the enemy. Um, if all the audience and us are trapped in a room this size, I mean, problems are going to arise pretty quickly, even if we all love each other. Um, so that difficulty of space travel, and there's a few pieces in the book that address this, um, of just the terrifying isolation, the lack of space, and the simplest things being problematic. Um, from the bookseller perspective, something that I realized pretty quickly in being a bookseller, which I've been for 9 years now, or at least with my own bookstore. I've worked at other bookstores. Is that reading is deeply intimate. Um, in a bookstore, people will confess and talk about subjects that you will not find them talking about in public most other places. Um, when we connect with the trauma in a book, for instance, and someone else has read that book and gone through it with us, I mean, it's shared experience, it's shared trauma. My reading taste is pretty heavy-handed. Sometimes people come in and they want something light, and I don't know what to tell them. I just, I don't carry cozy stuff. I don't read that way. I like to be challenged and attacked by the books I read. I want to go through a foreign experience and come out different. Literature teaches us to empathize that way. I'm not looking to read about my experiences. I've already experienced them. I want to go through something completely foreign. Um, and as we fall in love with the characters in stories and we go through those things with people, we begin to, I mean, there's even recent psychological studies that, fictitious characters light up the same part of your mind, of your brain, that deep friendships do. There's a real power in that. But in the conversations I have in the bookstore, it's amazing how intimate it gets with strangers. I mean, that can be anything from a shared or differing taste in erotica to, we both love Sylvia Plath's poetry. It really could be anything, but readers so deeply identify with the books they read. And there's a shield, armor that comes down immediately with strangers. And it's a sort of intense thing to have my workday be that over and over again with different people I've never met. I love it when there's repeat customers, because you start seeing this real window into them just through their taste or what book they didn't like. And that's one of my main questions with customers when they want a recommendation is, tell me a book you hated. I mean, that'll tell me more about someone's reading taste and probably about them than a long list of things that they loved. Not a lot of people are reluctant to get into that, but it's information rich. And so this story was definitely inspired by those conversations. And then also, reading is a solitary affair. So when we get to share these things at an event like this, or talking with a bookseller or another author, that's kind of a special thing because it's usually an alone activity. And that's why ultimately, I'd struggled to find the appropriate ending for this story. Um, and um, in a way, it was like burning down the bookstore. Oh, it should have been audiobooks and magazines and so forth. Um, but there's an immediacy to those things that I think is much easier for people to identify with each other than the time commitment of novels, which is wonderful. I mean, I adore getting lost in those worlds that all these wonderful writers create. Um, but it is a very alone place, and so I wanted to find ways to address how togetherness can happen through literature.
So I'm going to squeeze a question in here because you brought something up that raises it, and it has to do with confinement. A lot of these stories revolve around conflicts of confinement, whether physical or otherwise. Is that something that's on your mind when you're writing these stories? And secondly, is there any connection to being located in a very open area of the country to this sort of conflict or threat of confinement that comes across in your stories?
Well, to answer the latter part of that question first, one of the reasons I live in an open part of the country, as you say, is it reminds me very much of the sea, and I grew up near the ocean, and the endless vista, to be able to see very far. I mean, I came for stars and silence. I wanted to be able to see the universe at night, which you can't do in a city. Um, and I found that there was a direct correlation between how far I could see and the degree of hope that I had in my personal life. Living in cities, I've lived in forests, where you can't see much further than a block, felt extremely confining to me. And the further I can see, the more possibility I feel. So that definitely a thing for me. As far as the confinement, um, I've had a lot of anxiety throughout my life. I've felt trapped in my physicality, not really a part of it, disassociative stuff. And I think that's a very common theme. There's also some formative experiences. I've been to juvie a few times when I was a kid. Um, Counted a lot of bricks. You'll find when my characters get stressed out, they always start counting. That's another one of those weird patterns I didn't notice till later. And that um, I may be undiagnosed autism. That might be the counting thing comes from, but counting bricks was something I did a lot of in jail. And that, like working at the hotel with the horrible upper middle management, was a very formative experience in dehumanization. At one point in juvenile hall, there's a little buzzer and they won't answer it, and I had woven this whole scenario that there'd been some post-apocalyptic thing happened, that the jail had been abandoned, and that I was forgotten, and that I was going to have to eat the towel-sized blanket or something, or could I fit through the hole in the toilet? What does one do to escape? And so escape is a pretty common theme in my work too. Um, and I think about the millions and millions of people incarcerated in this country, and just what we do to people to strip freedom, and how freedom of the mind can combat this. Um, uh, Sexuality comes into play in that too, into the freedom of the mind and combating that societal confinement. So I think that is definitely a common theme in my work that occurs both because of my relationship with my own body, and feeling trapped in other situations. Now, I feel I have a great degree of freedom in my life now. I'm not. These are things that I've worked through, but there are certainly things that are going to appear again and again in my work, and often. The work takes place around a solitary character that feels disconnected from those and the things around them.
So I love a great time travel story. They are hard to pull off, and you did it really well with the two stories that are in this anthology. There are two time travel stories in there. I noticed that both deal with encounters with a character's prior or future selves. So without giving too much away, can you just share a little bit about those particular stories? And it seemed like a good segue at this point with what you were just discussing.
Well, I hope I pulled them off. I mean, the masterpiece of time travel in my mind is David Gerald's The Man Who Folded Himself, which is just one of the strangest novels about a relationship with yourself that I've ever read. Beautifully weird. I hope I can write something that bizarre when it comes to time travel. Um, in those particular stories, and this is one of those things I found that I've gone back to again and again without realizing it till the third or fourth time I did it. Um, those take place in an apartment I lived in my early 20s. And there was a point in my life where I'd been doing something else with my life and I was ready to make a change and I wanted to become a full-time writer, but I wasn't quite there. I'd written my first book. It was a mess. I didn't have any guidance and I wasn't really sure where I was going with this, but I knew that it was something I wanted to dedicate my life to. And I had done quite a bit of writing, but never very focused or committed. And at that point in my life, I was in my early 20s, I made a string of rash and bad decisions that racked me with guilt for a considerable amount of time. Again, it's one of those things I've moved past, but it was one of those things where I felt like I really fucked up and wasted 10 years. Um, and I found in a lot of my time travel stories that I would either go back and kill that kid or at least kick his ass. And I think it's sort of my way of atoning with the delay in writing that I shouldn't have done. I mean, things worked out great, and it was an interesting 10 years anyway, but I was pulled away for various reasons from what I really should have been doing. Um, and so I think it's my way of dealing with that to keep revisiting the moment of a bad decision, not to change it, but to punish that bad decision, which I guess is maybe a little bit different than some time travel stories. And it was one of those places that I lived for a long time, and it was a very formative place, and I went through a lot of things there. Um, so it seems like sort of a natural setting. It was also a place that was deeply uncomfortable. Um, and so to go back there over and over again and reconcile it. But again, it was one of those things. I think it was the third time I'd written a scene like that I was like, wow, I really go back to that place and that guy a lot, don't I? Hopefully I've differentiated them story-wise, but yeah, that's what that's about.
So you asked me this question when I was there and you were here, and now I get to ask it of you. So the stories in this collection are largely human focused. In most of your work, from what I've read at least, this seems to be consistent. Is it just happenstance that you don't lean into non-human characters, or is this a actual decision you make in earnest?
That might be unique to this collection. This is definitely human, more earth-based stuff. But I have written a lot of different aliens. My aliens usually come from my dreams. My previous short story collection, which came out in 2018, Echo of Creation, had a few alien stories in it. Um, one of my upcoming books takes place in an alien prison, and it has only one human character, or two human characters rather, and the majority are aliens, which is really fun to think about. Um, I sort of believe, without a lot of evidence, that a lot of our behavior is physiology. We're an expression of this meat suit, and a lot of our limitations in thinking are due to bodily limitations. So I love thinking about an alien character and what a different physiology does to a different psyche. um this story is not particularly heavy on that. I'm not sure if there's any aliens in there. um I think some of the ideas are alien, not necessarily a creature from another world. um but it just depends. Like I said, I'm a near past writer, with the minor tweak. And aliens haven't showed up yet, as far as I know. um I like reading about all the wacky accounts, but I don't know that I buy any of them. So yeah, it just sort of depends on what story I want to tell. the books that I have coming up, some of them are very earth-based, not even science fiction at all. Some of them are truly alien. But there's some books that are heavily inspirational to me that I aspire to. I mean, like if anyone's ever read Greg Bear's Hard Fought, it's one of the most alien books that I've ever written or ever read. Um, just truly bizarre, and that level of thinking where you have to think as an alien is truly challenging as a writer. I mean, even just another species on Earth is difficult to get into that psychology. And so aliens are notoriously challenging to write. I don't really do a lot of bug-eyed monster stuff, although I love that stuff too. Cora Bullard's bug bug-eyed monsters and the women who love them is some of the funniest stuff I've ever read, sort of parodying the pulp days. But being a human being, whether I felt alienated or not, it certainly makes that easier to write. But you will be seeing more aliens from me coming up soon.
Okay, great. We actually have a question in the chat that I'm going to relay to you. So you do so much in the spec fic community and support other writers. How do you find time to write your own work? Does it come in stages, or is it something you make time for every day?
So I'm a binge writer. I don't write every day. I write a lot sometimes. I would love to write every day, but yeah, my job keeps me very busy. And it's incredibly important to me to be supportive of culture. When I was young, I remember catching myself being like, oh, I wish I had been an adult in the 70s and I missed all the good stuff, which is such a jaded, ridiculous, youthful attitude. I realized pretty quickly that if I wanted to live in a rich culture with amazing things going on, that I had to actively participate and facilitate. I think there's so many wonderful, talented, amazing people out there doing a variety of things, but they need a place to do it. They need someone to support it and back it. And so that's just a mission in life. Writing for me, it's kind of a luxury. I running a business and doing other work. I don't have a lot of time for it. Fortunately, I write pretty fast. I'm always taking notes, so when it comes time to write, a lot of the heavy lifting's already done. But what I do typically is 2 months out of the year, I give myself a month to write a novella, and I wake up early, 4 or 5 in the morning. I write however many words I've set out for myself, usually 3 or 4 pages in a notebook, 750 to 1,000 words. And I do that every day until the book is done. So it'll take me 3 weeks to 6 weeks to write the first draft of a novella. Anyway, I love first drafts. I hate editing. I love editing for other people's work. I hate rewrites and editing for my own work. I wish I had a collaborator I could just give first drafts to and they would fix it. Maybe someday I'll find that person. I know some writers like the other way around, but I just love the idea phase where you can just kill the censor and go crazy. And one of the reasons I write longhand is because it forces me to commit to what's on the page. I can't edit as I go. That has to happen later. And I don't wait for inspiration. I don't trust the muse. Like, just get the work done. I find my best work is when I'm struggling and I'm not inspired. That I've just sat down to the grind to get it done. It seems like I'm very prolific out from the outside, but I write consistently 2-3 books a year. They're all sit in a drawer. I usually put them away for long enough to forget them, so hopefully I have some objectivity. And then the way things tear out looks like I'm just on fire cranking things out, and it's not true. It just builds up.
So I'm going to sneak in one more audience question and then ask a closing question. So the question from the audience is, I found Night Day to potentially be the most personal story in the collection. And while it seems like it could be very cut and dry domestic drama on the surface, it feels that there is some sci-fi elements in there. If so, how would you describe the sci-fi angle in that particular story?
So the personal element of this story is it takes place in that apartment I was talking about earlier. But that's sort of where it ends. the basic premise of the story, I was an insomniac for most of my life, really bad insomniac. The premise of the story is that insomnia is a form of time travel. And that's the science fictional element to that. That as you can't sleep, you are entering your younger self. And as your younger self dreams, he is transferring to the future body. And this is something that's fairly common. My second novella that I ever wrote, which was a disaster, maybe I'll get around to fixing it someday. The premise is that masturbation is a form of time travel. Um, and you know, I think a lot about the ways we interact with the past in our mind and how different memories express themselves and how that differs from person to person. Um, and I mean, in a way, when you remember something, you are time traveling. You know, and the vividness of the memory could be extreme, where you literally transport yourself there, not literally, but you know, you're essentially transporting yourself to another time. And so in that particular story, which I feel like is maybe one of the more challenging stories, one of the more uncomfortable stories in the book, um, I wanted to explore what it would be like to actually enter your younger self and what wearing the meat suit would feel like, because it'd be different, you know. I mean, the older we get, it's like stuff hurts and you know, you feel ragged or whatever, and you forget in that the youthfulness didn't hurt. And just what a contrast that would be. And contrast is one of those things that I try to hit really hard in my work. You know, in Birth of Fire, it did that too. You know, the macro and the micro. You know, actually night versus day and night day. Um, I love those extreme juxtapositions butted up next to each other, and what that says, and trying to build a rhythm that bounces between that level of contrast. Um, I think it makes for good drama, you know, to be sort of yanked from one to the other. It might be abrupt for some people's taste, but yeah, an exploration in that contrast. And then just, you know, what if something simple and mundane like insomnia or masturbation or whatever it is was actually this fantastical thing that could transport you?
Really interesting now that I think about it. That seems to be a theme through a lot of the works. I'm thinking like Frogger is another way in which that kind of being transported takes place. That as another short story in the anthology. So I wanted to close before I ask about what you're working on now by having you maybe provide a little bit of advice and guidance. So you know you do a lot of work as an editor. You read a lot of submissions. And you know your eyes have been on a lot of short stories. What do you look for in a successful piece of short fiction? What kinds of things are you looking for when your editor eyes are on and you're reading submissions and looking for a good quality story?
Well, I'm always attracted to the strange. Give me something weird, give me something I haven't seen before. That's always going to do it for me. Um, you know, obviously cleaner the better. You know, editors don't give a damn about typos. I remember when I first started, it's like, oh God, there was a typo. That's why I got rejected. No, it has nothing to do with it. We fix that stuff all day. No big deal. Um, I think mainly I want to either see something I haven't seen before, or if it's something I've seen before, I want an interesting and bizarre take on it. You know, a dash of surrealism always goes a long way with me. Um, you know, interestingly, I could probably be criticized for this myself, but the main reason I send rejections, and this is maybe more applicable to poetry than fiction, because I read a lot of thousands of poems every month for Starline, is did it feel like there was a narrative, or am I going, what the hell was this about? I mean, that's the main thing, where if it's overly personal, and I think I could boil that down to write a story about us, the we, instead of I. Now there's nothing wrong with doing that, and it can certainly be pulled off. Obviously it can. Um, but that's I think the main thing that I look for. You know, I like a writer to commit, unless it's a time travel story, to commit to a time frame too. When I see conjugation all over the place, that's sort of a turn off. I feel like the writer's been lazy or not proofread their own work. Um, when I'm reading for simultaneous times, it's also imperative that it be something that can translate to audio format. I've read such wonderful stories that I've had to say no to, just because they're not going to work off the page. And that can go both ways. Sometimes things work only in audio that won't work on the page. And so I think when, if someone's submitting something to me, just be aware of the format. Read your work out loud, I think, is the best thing a writer can do for themselves. And I don't mean read it to your mom or your loved one. Don't trust their opinion. They love you. They're proud of you. They should be. Um, Try and find someone that doesn't like you to read it to, or that's, that finds you dubious or something. But reading your work out loud to yourself or to someone else, I think is the best thing you can do for refining stuff. I find when I do readings, like this or on stage somewhere, I'll be changing it as I go, and it's editing yourself is difficult, but that's the best way to go about it. So those are some of the things I look for. Give me something bizarre. I'm into it, I also love humor, which is notoriously difficult to write. I think a lot of fiction takes itself a little too seriously. So I don't like it when things are overly self-aware, but a little bit of that in there. Um, if you can make me laugh, if you can make me cry, you're probably going to be one of my favorite writers.
Great. So tell us, what's next? What do you have coming up? Can you share anything about any projects or plans in the near future?
Yeah, there's a lot going on right now coming up. Pull up this list so I even remember. I've got a couple books coming out this year. I'm going to be in a set of novellas called American Muse from Starlight Pulp, that's been doing wonderful anthologies and stuff. This will be their first novella collection. It's going to be my first publication of a Western. It's a Western novella called Black Line Trail. Um, it's kind of odd for a Western because there are no horses, there is no gunfighting, there's no Native Americans, and there's no weepy Latina girl that needs to be saved. I intentionally avoided every possible Western trope that I could think of. The man versus nature story. It's bleak. I suppose most of my writing is, though. So that'll be coming out, I think, in October. And then shifting gears, I have my first gay science fiction erotica book coming out, which I think will be out in December. It'll be packaged with a twin novella with author named Peter Schutz from Peter Schutz Publishing. This takes place in an alien prison. It's a tribute to Jean Genet. It's got a lot of gay sex with a lot of different aliens. But ultimately, it's a story about freedom, imprisonment, and dehumanization. Although I find in writing that book, I'm like, we need another word, because when it's other species too, it's not really dehumanization. Like, is it depersonization? I'm not sure, but they're people, whether they're aliens or not. They're all sentient people. So it's about dehumanization, imprisonment, and finding freedom of the mind and the body within that. Hopefully this year, or at least early next year, I'll have a book of sci-fi coup coming out called The Future is Brief, which is I don't know, about 150 or so science fiction themed haiku, little brief poems, which I write a lot of. Those are fun. It's usually a great way to test and see if an idea is going to work or not. But I love the brevity of that stuff. I will be reading on September 4th at Story Hour with Tara Campbell, who's here. I can't wait. This is going to be a really cool night. And I have a lot of appearances coming up for the rest of the year too. I'll be at EagleCon in October with Pedro. I'm going to be reading at Speculative Poetry, Akua Leslie Hope Speculative Poetry Sundays on November 21st. I'll be at LostCon in person in November. And I think I'll be speaking at Flights of Foundry as well, a great online convention this year. So I'll be out there talking more than anyone could possibly want to hear me speak.
Fantastic. And despite you downplaying it, that is definitely a prolific few months coming up, as far as I'm concerned. But thank you, John Paul, for coming today and speaking to us. And for the audience, go out and grab a copy of Cardboard Spaceship. There's a link in the chat for those who are here in the audience. Good luck with the rest of the release and all of these upcoming writing events and publications. Thanks to everyone who came tonight. And there is, I think, a link potentially to the next event. Jean Paul, is there a link in the chat to the next event as well?
I'm putting that in there right now. That will be a release party for Pedro Inigue's Mexicans
Oh,
on the
wonderful.
Moon, which is coming out on shoot, they're over there, on September 3rd from Space Cowboy Books. This is such a fine book. You got to come hear this in Pedro's voice. This is probably the first in publishing history. I accepted it for publication the day I received the submission. It's that good. That's a first for me, probably a last for me. But yeah, please come to see Pedro read, because this is a heavy-hitting, phenomenal book of speculative poetry.
Again, thanks, Jean Paul, and thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thanks to everyone who was here tonight.